and very personal. How would they all have had the same mass hallucination?
Yeah, so I guess the idea is maybe you have this close-knit group so wrapped up in the idea of resurrection that perhaps you can, quote, fool some people, a few people, but by no means could you get the whole lot of them, especially 500 at a time.
This is incredibly implausible to be able to pull that off. It gets worse, though. Mary in the garden might have been a possible candidate for a hallucination. But what about, Joe, those people who were not so favorably disposed to the cause of Jesus? Would James have had an hallucination who said, along with his family, I think my brother is off his rocker. He is not in an emotional state that would have led him that way. And I guarantee Saul of Tarsus would not be an ideal candidate to have had an hallucination, as opposed as he was to all of these kinds of things. So it is, again, accounting for all of the data and the variety of it. We've asked the question, would the 500 brethren that Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 15, would they have had the same exact hallucination? Very, very difficult. Now, the apostles, as Orthodox Jews, they didn't believe in a risen Messiah, Joe. Since hallucinations are mere projections of what is already in the mind, the apostles would never have had a resurrection hallucination.
So that wasn't in the picture.
That wasn't in the picture. They were thinking some kind of general resurrection at the end of time, but the idea that the Messiah would rise from the dead, it took them by surprise. In fact, Jesus has to even tell them and remind them of what was predicted in this context. The hallucination hypothesis also doesn't account for the empty tomb. We're back to that needing more than one explanatory hypothesis. The hallucination, if it were adequate, might explain the visual appearances, wouldn't explain the empty tomb.
Ken, could we liken this, and boy, I hate to get people who believe in UFOs angry unnecessarily, but could we liken this to alleged UFO sightings, in that it's possible that somebody who really wants to believe a UFO could see one, but there's no way you're going to get everybody who happens to be in that vicinity. There'll be other alternative hypotheses, maybe some with more scientific merit, that will override this supposed UFO sighting. Can we liken it that way a little bit?
I think you could. And of course, to have a hallucination, because it is created from the inner subjective psychological state of mind, there has to be the anticipation of something. In the case of the apostles, they didn't expect it.
Right.
And how would you have differing personalities? They're not all people suffering from emotional difficulties or a lack of food or things like this. This makes it very difficult. And I think ultimately this hypothesis cannot account for the facts and has very, very limited explanatory power.
Okay, well, that's the fifth one.
We got one more, number 6.
Is this one going to rescue us now?
Well, I think you're going to find this very intriguing. This is a very interesting one. How about hypothesis 6? Jesus could have had an identical twin brother who was separated at birth but later returned to impersonate the resurrected Christ.
Wow.
Now, I know where this hypothesis came from. It came from a person who said, look, miracles are so improbable, they don't happen. Therefore, as improbable as it might be, this is a better explanation because supernatural miracles are so improbable.
Yeah, so there's that, did you call it a priori reasoning?
That's right.
Yeah.
You really can't have something going against this claim because it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Boy, this would seem tough to pull off. Where do you hide that twin brother, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, think of the scenario. You've got this Jesus look-alike, right? And he has to somehow discover his amazing resemblance to Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the idea is they're twins separated at birth.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the scriptures tell us that Mary and Joseph had a single child named Jesus. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't fit the facts there right away. But I mean, consider what would happen. Would this look-alike come along and notice Jesus and say, wow, we look a lot alike. And then he'd kind of lurk in the, in the shadows for a while, and then discover that Jesus is crucified. So he does what? He inflicts the wounds in his hands and in his feet. Does he do it by himself? Does he have somebody working with him to do this kind of thing? And then he jumps out at the last second and presents himself as the risen Lord. Of course, what happened to the empty tomb and the rock? And does he get people to push the stone away? And where does this guy go? And who would do this kind of thing? What would motivate somebody to do this kind of thing?
How much was he paid?
Yeah, I mean, I think this illustrates the point, Joe, that this is really an ad hoc hypothesis. It's coming along to try to explain things that aren't adequately explained by the theory. This theory is bizarre and terribly implausible. It assumes that miracles don't happen. So, what are we left with? I think we are left with 6 naturalistic hypotheses that lack explanatory power and scope, are inconsistent, don't fit all of the data, cannot explain all of the data. You need multiple theories to be able to explain everything, and they're not terribly coherent. And so I would encourage people to go back to the resurrection hypothesis and back to that earlier quote by William Lane Craig, that the resurrection, the interpretation that Jesus did rise from the dead bodily, it is a single theory that does fit the data. Now, if you're a skeptic listening, or you're an agnostic, it may challenge you to consider the supernatural. But Joe, I think the way you deal with things like that is you study the evidence and you open yourself to where the evidence directly leads, even if it challenges your presuppositions.
Yeah. Ken, would an attorney follow this line of thinking, the way you've outlined it here in this series of podcasts?
Very much so. In fact, one of the distinguished attorneys at Harvard University 100 years ago, Simon Greenleaf, was a distinguished attorney, a jurist, a scholar of the law, and he wrote a book about the resurrection and the apostles' testimony, and he concluded in that in a unbiased courtroom, they would have concluded that there is a powerful case to be made for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That book is still available.
That's Simon Greenleaf?
Simon Greenleaf. I'm not sure I can give you the exact title, but it is in Without a Doubt, so you can reference my book.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Ken. That brings us to the 7th of 8 podcasts, and you're going to leave us with some hope on the next one, right?
I am. We're going to talk about why does all this matter, and why is it so important that at the heart of our faith is a resurrected Christ, and I don't want anybody to miss it, because that's the real payoff.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. You have written about this in your book, Without a Doubt, so people can consult that resource to learn more about the resurrection. We sure hope you have enjoyed this series. Give us some feedback or some questions, if you will, at ask@reasons.org. And